Well, good evening. Our debate topic for tonight is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Christian and Muslim perspectives. I think we are honored and in for a treat for our two debaters that we have here tonight. A weakness that's often seen in debates is that one side or the other understands their own position very well, but doesn't necessarily understand in any complete sense the other individual's position.
But think about this. Why have so many Muslims over the centuries been wrong about Jesus, if they are wrong about Jesus? Why have they been so wrong? Could it be that the Quran simply isn't clear enough in what it says about Jesus' crucifixion? And this would bring us to the third point of agreement. Shabir and I agree that Surah 4, verse 157 of the Quran is extremely vague and confusing.
We must say right off the bat that Christian scholars now are largely acknowledging that Acts of the Apostles did not write down precisely what the disciples preached. The author wrote down the kinds of things which he thought it would have been natural for the disciples to preach. So it's not their exact words. But okay, let's take the words as they are. Now you go to Acts of the Apostles chapter 2, and Peter makes his first public declaration. And he declares that Jesus has been raised. Muslims do not have any difficulty with that.
Thank you again, Shabir. Shabir said earlier that when I talk about the wounds in my description of the crucifixion, I'm simply taking what the Gospels say for granted. Actually, everything I said about crucifixion I got from non-Christian sources. So that comes from other Jewish and Roman descriptions of crucifixion. So we know how crucifixion worked, and it worked exactly like we find it in the Gospels. He said that scholars point out that we have to wonder what killed Jesus because crucifixion pierces no vital organ. Right, when scholars discuss what kills you during crucifixion, it's because so many different things can kill you during crucifixion. You can go into shock, you can have a heart attack, you can die by asphyxiation, and they say that it'll sort of depend on what position you're nailed and how severe the scourging was, but they're not doubting that you die from crucifixion. He cites Marcus Borg, arguing that the texts have evolved over time, and he points out that I cited Marcus Borg. I quoted Marcus Borg to show that even the most radical scholars who never agree with anything, who are so far out on left field on the theological spectrum that they would almost fall off, even they agree that not only that Jesus died, but that it's historically certain. And they agree that Jesus' apostles, his disciples, were completely convinced that he appeared to them afterwards. So even the most radical scholars agree on the points that I used in my opening statement. Also notice that if Shabir is rejecting those points, Jesus' death and the disciples' belief that he appeared to them, then he's further out there than they are on the theological spectrum in terms of what counts as evidence. Shabir says that we see an evolution from Mark to John. And, you can look at examples like a young man in Mark, and then later it's an angel, and so on. You can do this kind of with any text. You can go to differences, and whatever order you want them in, you can say, you see the evolution. So, for instance, in Mark reports 18 miracles of Jesus. Matthew and Luke each report 20 miracles of Jesus. But Mark is much shorter than Matthew and Luke, so as far as a proportion of the content, Mark has a far more miraculous Jesus than we find in Matthew and Luke. John, the latest, the most evolved, the most embellished, has 7 miracles. Why is the evolution and embellishment going in the wrong direction? Well, the answer is that if you have texts with different authors emphasizing different things for different audiences, they're going to share different details. And you can always, whatever order you have them in, pick out the details and say, you see, they're changing the story as they go along to make it bigger. Well, John should have hundreds of miracles then, if he's starting with 18 in Mark and this is decades later. He says that Mark is late, 65 to 75, Matthew and Luke afterwards, John around 100. Do you know why many scholars give those late dates for the text? There's one main reason, and that's that Jesus predicts the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in 70. So if you're a skeptic and you don't believe Jesus could predict the future, then you say, well, it must have been while these horrible events were going on. That's the reason that we have to give it these late dates. Well, we're Christians and Muslims in here, right? We're not atheists. We believe that Jesus could predict the future. So if Jesus predicts the fall of Jerusalem, that's no reason for us to agree with these dates. So if you know why scholars give these late dates, and you know that you don't agree with their reasons for giving them the late dates, then you might want to rethink the dates. But apart from that, notice what I did in my opening statement. I went to the 1 Corinthians Creed. What did scholars say about that one? What did the same scholars who would date the Gospels to the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, what did they say? They said that's extremely early material, possibly within months, but at least within a couple years of Jesus' crucifixion. And what did you have there? Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and appeared to numerous people, groups and individuals, friends and foes. So I went immediately in my opening statement to the earliest possible material we have. It confirmed everything I said, and Shabir goes to much later sources to respond. Shabir goes with Daniel Smith, and says, well, he argues that Jesus was taken from heaven to heaven from the tomb, as if this agrees with our with the Islamic view. Notice the name of the book, The Post-Mortem Vindication of Jesus in the Sayings Gospel Q. I could point out that almost no one agrees with Daniel Smith, but let's at least be clear on what he's saying. He's saying that Jesus did die. So even the scholar that Shabir quoted agrees with me that Jesus died. Shabir goes to the book of Acts. He says, Peter quotes Psalm 16 in Acts chapter 2. But in that psalm, it's about someone who didn't die. Well, let's read what else Peter says in Acts chapter 2, same sermon, verses 23 to 24. Peter says, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. In the very chapter that Shabir goes to prove his case, Peter says that Jesus died and rose from the dead, exactly what I've been saying. So if that's where you're getting your evidence, I'd say you might want to look somewhere else. As for the apostles quoting Psalms, where someone is talking and didn't actually die, but the disciples are interpreting this as fulfillments of prophecy for Jesus, we can't read these documents like 21st century, even Christians and Muslims. If we want to know what they're talking about, we'd have to read them as first century Jews and first century Christians. And they had a method of interpretation called remez, which is, remez means hint. And the texts are giving you hints about something. And so if a text says, I was in the dust of death, but he didn't literally die, they would look to that and say, ooh, what happens if this applies literally to someone else to come? Now you can say that's a bad method of interpretation, but if you're saying it's a bad method of interpretation that they used, why would you agree with their identification of which Psalms are about Jesus? You're saying they have a flawed method. So you have no reason to think these Psalms are about Jesus apart from what they said. But what they said, they're using their own methods of interpretation, which are completely in line with Jesus dying. Now, Shabir says that when they became uppermost, this could mean all kinds of things. We don't know what it means when he says that the true followers of Jesus would become uppermost. But notice what it says. It says that Allah aided the followers of Jesus until they became uppermost. If Shabir is correct, the first generation of Muslim followers of Jesus were wiped out or abandoned or changed their minds so quickly that we have no record of their existence except in texts that constantly proclaim Jesus' death and resurrection, and we try and sift our way through these. But that's just not a good methodology. So everything we have, every source we have, still affirms Jesus died by crucifixion and rose from the dead. Just no way around this.
So this, I believe, is the final rebuttal session. Am I right? How much time do I have? 8 minutes? Okay. So, very quickly, David says that Jesus appeared even to people who did not previously believe in him. And he cites as an example of that James. But actually, some conservative scholars now think that James must have believed in Jesus even prior to the crucifixion, let's put it that way. And a scholar I can cite in that regard is Richard Bauckham. In his book, Jude and the Relatives of Jesus in the Early Church. So it's not true to say that Jesus appeared to his foes, unless you mean by that Paul alone. And then it depends on Paul's own witness. Now, you might have thought that, okay, Paul's testimony is asserted elsewhere, like in the Acts of the Apostles, but I've told you about the value of Acts of the Apostles, and now there are some of the critical scholars that David has been citing now date Acts of the Apostles in the second half of the 2nd century of Christianity, 115. So that was long after the time of Paul, and they think that the we passages where the writer says we, implying that he was there on the scene, are not really true. So we do not have any proper verification that Jesus actually appeared to Paul. And Paul himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 spoke about the devil appearing as the angel of light to deceive even the very elect, if that were possible. And since Paul wasn't one of the very elect at that time when the light appeared to him, there still remains a question about what appeared to him. So Acts of the Apostles actually shows that when Paul, after receiving this visitation on the road to Damascus, came to join the disciples, they were afraid of him. But this is Acts' way of polishing over something that is more serious. It's not only that they're afraid of him, but they're suspicious of him, and they don't think that they can really trust what he's saying at that point, which would be very weird because it would mean that those disciples who already have the Holy Spirit are afraid of Paul, who now has the Holy Spirit. It wouldn't work. So something is wrong there. How do we get around to that? The simple way forward is to recognize that there was an early Christian belief that Jesus was taken from the tomb itself, that he didn't come out and meet with his disciples, but Luke and others tried to make it appear this way. David says, well, there's no evolution because look at the miracles. You have more miracles in Mark, but look at the quality of the miracles. I should point out to you that evolution is not always in a straight line. It's like a tree. It branches out. Whether we're talking about biological evolution or the evolution of cars or computers or cell phones, sometimes something develops in a certain direction, but for some reason it doesn't go forward. Maybe a company goes bankrupt and their research ends and so on. So the evolution stops in a certain direction and then it branches off in a different direction with some of the original ideas are picked up and made bigger and stronger in another direction and so on. So what do we actually find? We find that the descriptions that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he came out of the tomb is not in Mark, but in Matthew, in Luke, and in John. And you can see that each one describes things in a way that fits their own theological perspective. So Matthew has it that the disciples go to Galilee and there they see Jesus, but they doubt it, even though they worshipped him. But Luke has the angels and Jesus himself tell the disciples to stay in the city because that is where they will see him. And indeed, they only see him in Jerusalem. And there's no chance for them to have gone to Galilee and seen Jesus and come back. For Luke, it's only in Jerusalem. So James Dunn, a conservative Christian scholar, in his 3-volume work, Christianity in the Making, he says quite plainly that Luke has changed even the statement of the angels. So where the angels in Mark says to the women, tell the disciples to go to Galilee, there they will see me. So Luke has changed it so that the angels say something different. It's no longer that go to Galilee, it's remember when Jesus was in Galilee, he told you? So, and then they remembered his words and they told the disciples. But what are they going to tell the disciples and what are the disciples to do? They're to stay in Jerusalem, not Galilee. So this is a major point. It's not a simple discrepancy here. We're not picking at hairs here. We're asking, did Jesus appear in Jerusalem or did he appear in Galilee? And there are two different narratives here, two different gospels, each with their own particular axe to grind, and they're tailoring the reports and modifying the whole thing to make it look like what they're saying is true. Now, in Luke's gospel, Jesus appears to be very physical. He eats fish. Whereas in Paul's proclamation, which Dave presented as, this is like an early kerygma, it's very spiritual. Yes, Paul speaks of a spiritual body, but whatever that means. But Paul is saying that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So it's contrasted with, on the other hand, Luke is saying that Jesus said, touch me, because the spirit does not have flesh and bone as you see me have. So Paul is saying not flesh and blood, and Luke is saying flesh and bone. So there's something wrong here. Each one is tailoring the narrative according to what fits them. We're not getting the original story. So what Daniel Smith has done is to try to get us back to the original story, or at least to an earlier story. Sure, not everybody agrees with him, but he was not the first person to say this. In fact, he was able to pull on scholars before him. For example, the scholar Reginald Fuller, who wrote a book entitled The Formation of the Resurrection Narratives. And he says that in Mark's Gospel, what we have here is obviously an idea that Jesus has been translated from the tomb into heaven. That's an earlier idea that actually is pre-Markan. They say that this must have been in a pre-Markan passion narrative before even Mark took it. So while we have said here that Mark is the first of our four Gospels, and the others can be seen as modifying Mark over time, we're seeing now that even Mark has modified the previous narratives which was there before him. And one such previous narrative was the Gospel Q. And Daniel Smith is saying that in the Gospel Q, as far as it can be reconstructed, it is obvious that the way in which God vindicated Jesus in the end, and the way in which God said to everyone, look, Jesus is my man, is to raise him from the tomb. Now, Dieter Zeller, who is cited often in Daniel Smith's book, a German scholar, said that when we connect this with the sign of Jonah, also in the Q Gospel, it is obvious that we're talking about a person who was rescued before dying. He came close to death, but God rescued him and saved him. So that is the Muslim position which I've argued for here, and that position is seen very clearly when we recognize the evolution in the Gospel. So it's not the number of miracles, but the quality and type of miracles. And Bruce Metzger has shown in his book on the development of the Christian scriptures that when we compare the actual miracles which are in Mark with the way they are represented in Matthew and Luke, you will see that Jesus becomes bigger and greater in the miracles that he does, the very same ones. And in a similar way, when we come to the crucifixion and the resurrection, we see the development happening everywhere. And I thank you very much.